He'd lost everything: his wife, his home, his purpose. Until one late night, searching for a reason to keep going, he stumbled on a video that would change his life. Two rusted containers by a quiet Montana creek, forgotten and left to rot. Most saw decay. He saw a second chance. With his loyal German shepherd, a dog named after a fallen brother in arms, he set out to rebuild not just a home, but himself. What followed was a journey of healing, danger, and a bond that would pull others back from the edge. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in fresh starts, in the power of one loyal heart to change everything, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. The wind in Bitterroot Valley, Montana, had a habit of carrying the scent of pine and snow even on days when the sky was clear. That morning, the sun was doing its best to warm the valley floor, but the air still had the crisp edge of late autumn. Beyond the ridge, the jagged Bitterroot Mountains stood like ancient sentinels, their peaks powdered with early snow. The small town sat quietly along the river, framed by tall golden grasses swaying in the wind and the occasional rattle of an old pickup truck on the gravel road. This was a place where the seasons didn't just visit, they took root. Ethan Walker, 42, stood on the back porch of a modest rental house at the edge of town, a steaming mug of coffee cooling in his hand. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of build that came from years of practical labor, not gym vanity. His dark hair was now threaded with silver, and the lines at the corners of his gray eyes spoke of long nights and harder days. Before this, he had been a combat medic in the Army years of rushing into chaos, patching up the wounded under fire, and carrying the weight of lives saved and lost. But the past 2 years had been a different kind of war. His wife, Claire, had fought cancer with quiet defiance, until one October morning she simply couldn't anymore. Since then, Ethan had been adrift. His days were mechanical, his nights worse. The only constant was Jake. Jake was an 8-year-old German shepherd, his coat a deep mix of black and warm brown, the fur thickest around his neck like a built-in scarf against the cold. A faint scar ran along his right flank, almost hidden unless the light caught it. His left ear stood tall while the right drooped ever so slightly, a mark from an old injury. His amber eyes were intelligent but soft, the kind that could disarm you with their quiet loyalty. Jake had been named in honor of Sergeant Jacob "Jake" Malone, Ethan's closest friend during deployment, killed in an ambush overseas. Ethan had found the pup at a shelter just weeks after returning from the service, small enough to fit under one arm, but already carrying the same alert, watchful expression as the man whose name he now bore. Jake had been there through it all, the sleepless nights after the war, the mornings when grief over Claire made getting out of bed feel impossible. He was more than a dog. He was Ethan's anchor. That morning, after a night of restless turning, Ethan sat in his worn armchair with Jake curled at his feet. His laptop was open on the coffee table, playing a YouTube channel he'd discovered months ago, a channel devoted to stories of healing and second chances. The calm voices and gentle imagery didn't fix the ache in his chest, but they gave him something to hold on to in the quiet hours. He wasn't looking for anything in particular when the next video began. The thumbnail showed 2 weathered shipping containers painted forest green, set side by side on a grassy clearing near a stream. The title read, "Off-Grid Container Home for Sale, Willow Creekside Property." The video was simple. A slow pan of the exterior, a shot of the clear stream winding past, the rust along the container edges, and the way the metal roof had caved slightly on one end. The voiceover mentioned the property's history. A retired woodworker named Howard Gaines had lived there for nearly a decade before moving in with his son in Missoula. Howard had passed away the previous winter, and his son was now selling the land and the home as is. Ethan paused the video, leaning forward. The place was nothing fancy, in fact, it was rough. The green paint had peeled in places, revealing the reddish-brown of rust. The stream was narrow but alive, its banks lined with willows that dipped their branches into the water. The containers had windows cut into them, their frames streaked with rain marks, and the small deck out front was weathered to a silvery gray. But there was space. There was quiet. He imagined the sound of the water at night, the smell of the pines. Most of all, he imagined breathing without the weight of the city pressing in. The decision didn't happen in one lightning moment. It was more like a tide, rising until it was the only possible direction forward. Within a week, Ethan had called the number in the listing, met with the son in a coffee shop, and put down the payment using the proceeds from selling his house in Billings and nearly everything inside it. The few things he kept fit into his old army duffel: clothes, a framed photo of Claire, his service medals, and Jake's worn leather collar from his first year. 2 weeks later, Ethan and Jake drove west in his dusty Ford truck, the back loaded with essentials: a cot, a folding table, a small propane stove, and enough kibble to keep Jake happy for a month. The drive into Bitterroot Valley was long and winding, the air growing cooler as the road climbed. By the time they reached the turnoff onto the dirt track leading to Willow Creek, the afternoon sun was spilling gold through the aspens, and Jake was sitting tall in the passenger seat, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. The property was exactly as in the video, but somehow smaller and larger all at once. Smaller in the sense that the containers were plainly humble, larger because of the openness of the land, the way the stream caught the sky, the silence that seemed to welcome them in. Ethan parked by the leaning mailbox at the edge of the property and stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. Jake leapt down beside him, ears forward, tail sweeping the air in slow arcs. The smell of damp earth and rust hung in the breeze. A voice called from the tree line, "Mr. Walker?" Turning, Ethan saw a woman approaching from a footpath between the willows. She was in her late 60s, tall and thin with a frame that seemed both fragile and unyielding. Her hair, a soft silver, was pinned back neatly, and her face had the weathered beauty of someone who had lived outdoors much of her life. This was Mrs. Ellery, the neighbor from the adjacent property. She greeted Ethan with a smile that didn't quite reach her sharp blue eyes that spoke of years of loss. Later, he would learn that she'd lost her husband in a logging accident decades ago, an event that left her fiercely independent, yet quietly generous. "Howard always said someone would come along who'd see the good bones in this place," she said, nodding toward the containers. From behind her back, she brought out a large, scuffed wooden toolbox and set it on the porch. These were his. "They fixed everything from chicken coops to rocking chairs. Figured you'd put 'em to use." She also handed over a weathered plank with the word "Creek Light" carved into it in looping script. "Howard named it after the way the sun hits the water here in the evenings. Makes it glow." Ethan felt something settle in his chest, a small piece of the hollow space filling. Jake nosed the plank, sniffed the toolbox, then gave Ethan a look as if to say, "We can work with this." Standing there, with the wind off the creek and the willows swaying, Ethan knew he'd made the right choice. Not because it would be easy, but because it was a place where he and Jake could start breathing again. The morning light spilled through the willows like liquid gold, dappling the mossy banks of Willow Creek. The air carried the crisp bite of early winter approaching, mingling with the sweet, earthy scent of wet leaves. Ethan had been up since dawn, sleeves rolled to his elbows, clearing the tangle of wind-blown branches and last season's weeds from around the containers. Jake padded nearby, his paws leaving deep impressions in the damp soil, nose low to the ground, tail moving in slow, deliberate arcs. There was something meditative about yard work here, no hum of traffic, no city noise, only the rhythm of rake on gravel, the occasional ripple of the stream, and Jake's steady breathing. Ethan had just bent to lift a rotted plank when he heard the soft splash of paws in shallow water. "Jake, out of there!" he called, half expecting the dog to ignore him. Instead, Jake emerged from the creek, fur dripping, jaws carrying something that caught the sunlight. He dropped it gently onto the grass and nosed it toward Ethan. It was a bracelet tarnished silver, thin but sturdy, with the name MIA etched into a small oval charm. The clasp was broken, as though it had been yanked free. Ethan turned it over in his palm, feeling an unexpected weight in that tiny piece of metal. He pocketed the bracelet, planning to ask Mrs. Ellery about it later, but by nightfall the mystery solved itself. He was sitting in his kitchen area, a corner of one container where he'd set up a folding table, propane lantern, and an old transistor TV he'd found at a thrift store, when the local news anchor's voice cut through the static. "Authorities are searching for 7-year-old Mia Turner, last seen near her home on Clearwater Road late yesterday afternoon." Ethan stared at the screen. The picture showed a girl with sandy blonde hair, big green eyes, and a shy, gap-toothed smile. She wore a light denim jacket over a pink shirt. The anchor went on about the search efforts, the plea from the family, the hotline number, but all Ethan could think about was the bracelet in his pocket. He didn't wait until morning. He dialed the non-emergency number, and within 20 minutes, the crunch of tires on gravel signaled the arrival of a dark blue county SUV. Deputy Mason Cole stepped out, a tall man in his late 30s, with a lean, rangy build and the kind of posture that came from years in uniform. His hair was a close-cropped dark blonde, flecked with gray at the temples, and his jaw was square, the set of it calm but attentive. Mason had the steady gaze of someone who listened more than he spoke, and an economy of movement that suggested both military and law enforcement experience. Ethan handed him the bracelet and explained where Jake had found it. Mason turned the charm over in his gloved hands, studying the engraving. "Matches the missing girl's name," he said quietly. Jake, who had been sniffing the deputy's boots, suddenly froze, nose lifted to the breeze. His ears pricked forward, and he trotted toward the waterline, stopping where the mud was softest. He began pacing in tight circles, then lowered his head and sniffed along a faint trail that hugged the bank. Mason followed, flashlight beam dancing over the ground. That was when Ethan noticed the tire marks, faint but distinct, cutting across the narrow strip of sand and disappearing into the grass. They were older than the ones Mason's SUV had left, the tread pattern different, wider. A few feet away, a large boot print sank into the damp earth, the edges softened by moisture but still readable. "Men's size 12, maybe 13, Mason murmured. He snapped a few photos with his phone, his expression tightening. While Mason worked, Mrs. Ellery appeared from the path between their properties, her worn cardigan buttoned crookedly over a flannel shirt. "Evening, boys," she called, but her eyes were on the ground near the tire tracks. "I've been telling folks someone's been nosing around these woods. Tall fella, scruffy beard, drives an old green pickup. Seen him twice in the last month near my back fence. Don't like the way he watches." She shook her head, tucking a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "Name's Randall Briggs. Used to work odd jobs, but mostly keeps to himself. Or so he wants you to think." Mason made a note of it, thanked her, and then turned back to Ethan. "If your dog picked up her scent here, we may be looking at a drop point where she was moved from one place to another. These tire tracks could be important." Jake returned then, tail stiff, ears swiveling as if catching a sound they couldn't hear. He sat next to Ethan, gaze fixed on the dark line of trees upstream. Mason left shortly after, promising to send a team to canvass the area at first light. Ethan stood on the bank long after the SUV's taillights vanished, one hand resting on Jake's head. The creek whispered by, carrying leaves and secrets toward the valley's edge. Something had happened here, something more than a lost bracelet, and Ethan could feel the undercurrent of it in his bones. Later that night, as the wind rattled the container walls, he set the bracelet on the small table beside Claire's photo. Jake lay stretched across the threshold, half inside, half out, as if guarding both worlds at once. "We're not letting this go, boy," Ethan said softly. Jake's tail thumped once against the floor, as if in agreement. The morning broke cold and gray, clouds hanging low over the Bitterroot Valley like a ceiling about to collapse. Frost dusted the tall grass along the creek, crunching under Ethan's boots as he and Jake waited near the property gate. The air was so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. Deputy Mason Cole's SUV pulled up, headlights dim in the muted daylight. He stepped out wearing a dark brown jacket over his uniform, his breath fogging in the chill. "Let's check that lead before the weather turns," he said, giving Jake a quick nod as the dog trotted over to sniff his boots in greeting. They followed the creek path upstream, Mason keeping his eyes on the ground while Jake kept his nose in the air, alert to every change in scent. After about 20 minutes, the trees opened to reveal a weather-beaten building sagging under years of neglect, the old carousel barn. It had once been part of the county fairgrounds decades ago, but the fair had moved closer to town, leaving this place to rot. The white paint had peeled to gray, and the roof's tin sheets curled at the edges like dead leaves. One set of barn doors leaned drunkenly on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust, old hay, and something sharper, an acrid tang of metal and oil. Sunlight filtered through warped slats in the walls, cutting narrow beams across the concrete floor. A few paint cans were scattered in the corner, lids rusted shut. Beside them lay dirty rags stiff with dried stains oil, maybe blood, it was hard to tell. The metallic odor was stronger here, almost biting the back of Ethan's throat. Jake froze mid-step, hackles rising, and let out a low growl. He padded across the floor, nose to the ground, before stopping at a section of the floor that looked oddly patched plywood laid over what should have been concrete. He pawed at the edge, nails clicking, then barked sharply. Mason knelt beside him, running his hand over the boards. "This isn't original. Help me lift it." Together, they pried it loose, revealing a round, rust-edged metal hatch beneath some kind of old utility access. It had been covered deliberately, the surrounding floor swept clean, as if to hide it. The hatch was locked, but not well. Mason used his multi-tool to jimmy it open. The hinges shrieked, and a wave of stale metallic air rolled out, mingled with the damp smell of earth. A ladder descended into darkness. Ethan aimed his flashlight down, but the beam hit only dirt and cobwebs a few feet below. Mason didn't go in. This was no place to explore without backup, but he took photos and marked the coordinates. They searched the barn further, finding little else until Jake nosed under a stack of warped plywood sheets. There, wrapped in plastic sheeting, was a large, yellowed map. They unrolled it carefully across a sawhorse. It was a survey of the old Stone Hollow quarry, abandoned 30 years ago after an accident collapsed one of the shafts. In red ink, a small X was marked along the northern edge close to where Willow Creek passed near the quarry's perimeter. Mason traced the route with his finger. If this is connected to Mia, it's bad news. Those shafts aren't safe, and they're hidden from the main road. On the walk back, the frost had begun to melt, releasing the smell of wet earth. Jake stayed close, his earlier energy replaced with a focused quiet, as if he understood the seriousness of what they'd found. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove into town. The weather had turned, clouds parting enough for thin sunlight to spill down Main Street. The American flag outside the VFW hall flapped lazily in the breeze. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of coffee and old varnish. Rows of tables were set up for the Thursday night dinner, and volunteers bustled between the kitchen and dining area. That's where he met Pastor Ruth Bennett. She was a woman in her early 50s, sturdy in build, with kind eyes behind square-framed glasses and auburn hair streaked with gray pulled into a practical bun. Her handshake was firm, her voice carrying the easy authority of someone used to comforting people in their worst moments. She'd been the VFW chaplain for 8 years, known for organizing community dinners, collecting winter coats for the homeless, and speaking plainly when she saw someone in need. "You're the new fella out by the creek," she said, smiling as she handed him a plate of steaming chili. "I hear you've been fixing up those containers." Ethan nodded, explaining a little about how he'd come to Willow Creek. Ruth listened without judgment, just a steady gaze that made it easier to speak than he expected. "That place has a spirit about it," she said finally. "You should think about making it a light for others. Somewhere folks can come when they've lost their way." The phrase, "a light for others," stuck with him all the way home. That evening, after feeding Jake and setting another log on the small wood stove, Ethan pulled out a notebook he hadn't touched in years. The last entry was from before Claire got sick. He stared at the blank page for a long time before writing a few hesitant lines addressed to Jonah, his younger brother, with whom he hadn't spoken in over a decade. They'd parted badly after their father's funeral, words thrown like knives over choices and old wounds. But sitting at his small folding table, warmed by the stove and the sound of Jake breathing nearby, Ethan felt the first stirrings of something that wasn't quite forgiveness yet, but might be the beginning of it. He wrote about the creek, the containers, and the idea of turning the place into what Ruth had called a light. He didn't know if Jonah would ever read it, but the act of writing felt like laying the first brick in something worth building. When he finally put the pen down, the valley outside was black and still, the only sound the steady rush of Willow Creek under the stars. Jake lifted his head from the rug, met Ethan's eyes, and thumped his tail twice as if to say he approved. By late afternoon, the sky over Bitterroot Valley had turned the color of bruised slate. Low clouds huddled against the mountain peaks, and a wet wind came sweeping down through the willows, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain. Ethan was outside, hammer in hand, working to secure the sheets of corrugated tin he had scavenged to create a temporary awning between the two containers. The idea was to keep the walkway dry, a small comfort in a place where storms came hard and fast. Jake lay nearby, chin on his paws, eyes tracking the shifting shadows along the tree line. It started as a drizzle fat drops plinking against the tin, then built into a pounding curtain of rain. The steady hammering of water on the roof blurred into the white noise of the storm. Ethan was about to head inside when Jake's head snapped up. He gave a short, sharp bark, then trotted to the far edge of the property, looking back as if to say, "Come on." Ethan sighed, grabbed his flashlight, and followed. Jake led him along the narrow deer path that curved toward the boughs of the pines. The rain made the needles glisten in the dim light, and the air was thick with the resinous scent of sap. The beam from Ethan's flashlight caught the ground mud churned in a way that spoke of recent activity. He crouched to look closer. There, pressed deep into the wet earth, were boot prints. Bigger than his, the edges softened by the rain but still distinct. A few feet further, the light glinted on something snagged on the top strand of a rusted barbed wire fence, a frayed scrap of blue denim, wet and heavy, the threads curling like tiny claws. He was still holding it when Mason's SUV came crunching up the dirt road, wipers flapping furiously. Mason stepped out, rain dripping from the brim of his cap, his jaw set in that focused way Ethan had come to recognize. "Got your call. Let's take a look." Ethan handed him the denim. Mason turned it over, nodding slowly. Fresh tear. This didn't happen weeks ago. Whoever left this might still be nearby. He radioed in, his voice low and clipped, requesting additional units to sweep the area. Jake pulled at the leash Ethan had clipped on him, insistent. Mason gestured. "Let's see where he takes us." They followed the dog deeper into the pines, the rain muffled now by the thick canopy overhead. The ground here was carpeted with needles, so their footfalls made little sound. Through the dripping branches, a shape began to emerge, long, low, and silver gray, dulled by rust and years of weather. It was an old Airstream trailer, half hidden under the lean of the pines. Ethan's first thought was that it looked abandoned, but the faint warmth still radiating from the metal skin told another story. Someone had been here recently. The door was closed but not locked. Mason went in first, his flashlight sweeping across the small, dim interior. The air smelled faintly of must, and something sweeter crumbled cookies maybe. On the small table sat a plastic tub of animal-shaped children's cookies, the kind you'd find in a school lunchbox. Next to it was a sheet of sparkly unicorn stickers, half the page peeled away. The sight made Ethan's stomach knot. Mason crouched, studying the stickers without touching them. "Kids have been in here. Recently." He scanned the rest of the space. A thin sleeping bag on the bench, a stack of paper cups, a half-empty jug of water. "No one's here now," he said, "but they're not far." He bagged the cookies and stickers for evidence, then stepped back out into the rain. They walked the perimeter, looking for fresh tracks, but the pine needles and rain had erased most of the story. Still, Jake's ears stayed high, his nose working overtime, catching scents that only he could read. Eventually, Mason decided to pull back and wait for the other units. "We'll post a car here tonight. If they come back, we'll know." Back at the containers, the rain was still coming down, though softer now, like the sky was exhaling. Ethan finished securing the last sheet of tin, the new awning rattling faintly in the wind, but holding firm. Just as he set down his hammer, Mrs. Ellery appeared from the path, a dish towel-covered pie plate balanced in her hands. "Thought you could use something warm," she said, smiling faintly. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her cardigan dotted with raindrops. She stepped inside, setting the pie a deep golden apple with a sugared crust on the counter. "Made it this morning. Don't you dare let it go to waste." Ethan thanked her and went to put on coffee, but when he turned back, half the pie's edge was mysteriously missing. Jake sat in the corner, tail thumping guiltily, a smear of crust clinging to the fur near his muzzle. Mrs. Ellery chuckled, the sound warm against the gloom. "Guess someone needed it more than you." They shared coffee and what was left of the pie while the rain tapped against the windows. Outside, the pines swayed and whispered in the wind, keeping their secrets for now. But Ethan couldn't shake the image of that trailer under the trees, the cookies, and the stickers. Somewhere out there, a frightened child might be waiting, and he and Jake were already in the middle of it. The next morning broke sharp and cold, the rain from the night before having left a damp sheen on every surface. Willow Creek ran higher now, its steady murmur a little more urgent, as if carrying secrets downstream. Ethan was on his knees outside, securing the last of the solar-powered lights he'd picked up at the hardware store in town. He'd decided to line the path between the gate and the containers with them, a small gesture to make Creeklight House more welcoming. Beside him, a half-finished wooden frame leaned against the wall, a low bed he'd been building from reclaimed pine planks for anyone who might need a place to rest. Across the door, he had just hung a hand-carved sign that read in simple letters, "If you're tired, please sit." Jake lounged nearby, ears twitching at the occasional gust of wind. Ethan had just stepped back to admire the lights when his phone buzzed. It was Mason. His voice was clipped but urgent. "We've got a sighting. Mia Turner. She was spotted at a gas station on Route 93 about 40 minutes ago. Surveillance caught her walking past the pumps looking disoriented, and then she was gone. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Gone? Camera shows her being pulled toward a green Ford pickup, the same beat-up one we've seen linked to Randall Briggs. The plate's half covered in mud, but it's him. My guess is she got away for a moment before he grabbed her again. Mason's voice hardened. We're running his known haunts. Stay alert. The call ended, but the tension stayed. Ethan turned back to his work, more to keep his hands busy than anything else. He needed to finish the bed before the forecasted frost set in. Around midday, he drove into town to pick up a bundle of cedar slats. By the time he returned, the shadows of the pines were stretching long across the clearing. He hoisted the wood from the truck bed and carried it around to the back of the container, where the workbench sat under the new awning. That's when Jake barked short, urgent. Ethan rounded the corner and froze. Standing in the open doorway was a small figure, dripping wet, hair plastered to her cheeks. Mia Turner. Her denim jacket hung loose on her thin shoulders, and her pink shirt was smeared with mud. Her green eyes darted from the room to Jake, who was already pressing close, his nose brushing her arm. Without a word, she knelt and wrapped both arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. Ethan dropped the cedar slats and crouched beside her. Mia, you're safe now. But she didn't answer, only clung to the dog. Up close, he could see she was shivering, her lips tinged blue. He coaxed her inside, wrapped her in a blanket, and handed her a mug of warm broth. She drank slowly, eyes flicking toward the door every few seconds. When Mason arrived 20 minutes later, Mia was huddled on the couch under the blanket, Jake lying protectively along her legs. Mason's expression softened for just a moment before he knelt in front of her. Mia, I'm Mason. I'm here to help. She didn't speak, but after a pause, she reached for a pencil and the notepad Ethan kept by the phone. Her small hand moved quickly, sketching a crude but detailed picture. A squat, square building with a pitched roof, set beside a tall metal tower. There were trees in the background, and a dark shape like a box near the base of the tower. Mason studied the drawing. That's the old water filtration shack, he murmured. It's near the quarry marked on that map we found. And if that's the storage box, it's where the access to the underground tunnels would be. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then that's where he's keeping her when she's not on the move. Mia tapped the paper, then drew a crude arrow pointing to the trees. Beside it, she sketched a small figure herself running. Then, a second figure, larger, reaching out. Mason's voice was low. That must have been her escape attempt at the gas station. He caught her again. They both knew time was running out. Mason stood, sliding the sketch into a plastic sleeve. We're moving tonight. I'll get a team ready. He crouched again, meeting Mia's gaze. You did good, kid. We're going to bring you all the way out this time. As the light faded, Ethan finished installing the last of the solar lamps, their soft glow pooling across the damp earth. Mia sat on the low bed frame he'd built, watching him work. Jake sprawled beside her, head on her lap. She reached down occasionally to scratch behind his ears, and for the first time, Ethan saw the hint of a smile on her face. That night, as the frost began to silver the clearing, Creek Lighthouse stood lit in the dark, a quiet beacon in the valley. Inside, a frightened child had found a moment of safety, and outside, 2 men and a dog were preparing for what came next. By the time night settled over Bitterroot Valley, the rain had gone from steady to relentless, hammering against the tin awning with a force that made conversation a shout. Willow Creek had swollen, its calm murmur replaced by the rush and roar of a river straining against its banks. Mason arrived at Creek Lighthouse in his rain gear, water dripping from the brim of his hood, his face grim under the flicker of the solar lights. We move now, he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm. Flood warnings are coming in, but if we wait until morning, that shack might be underwater, and so will anyone inside it. Ethan grabbed his heavy jacket and flashlight. Jake was already at the door, tail stiff, ears forward, reading the urgency in the air. The 3 of them piled into Mason's SUV, the windshield wipers battling sheets of rain as they drove the narrow service road toward the old quarry. The headlights cut swaths of light through the downpour, glinting off pools of standing water and the pale streaks of runoff streaming downhill. When they reached the edge of the quarry road, the rest of Mason's small team was already there. 2 deputies in rain-soaked tactical jackets, their faces hidden behind clear plastic shields on their caps. One of them, Deputy Clara Holt, was a compact woman in her early 30s with a strong jawline and sharp, focused eyes. She had a reputation for being precise in tense situations, the sort who didn't waste words. She nodded to Ethan briefly before checking her sidearm and radio. The group moved in a tight formation along the overgrown path to the filtration shack. The wind moaned through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, over the drumming rain, came a long, mournful howl wolves in the high country, stirred up by the storm. It sent a shiver down Ethan's back, though Jake only tilted his head, listening, before returning to the scent trail. The shack emerged from the gloom, a squat concrete structure with a corrugated roof perched at the edge of a drainage channel now churning with brown water. Mason raised a hand, signaling the team to hold. Through the sheets of rain, a figure emerged from the shadows near the shack, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a wary stiffness. Randall Briggs. His hair was plastered to his head, his beard matted, and his flannel shirt clung to him in the wet. In his hands, he gripped a mud-caked shovel like a weapon. "Step back," Mason barked, but Randall only tightened his grip, his eyes flicking between Mason and Ethan. Then Jake broke forward, a low growl rolling from his chest. Randall swung the shovel, but Jake dodged and lunged, teeth flashing in the beam of Ethan's flashlight. The dog slammed into Randall's side, knocking him back into the mud. The shovel clattered away, lost to the floodwater racing in the channel. Mason and Deputy Holt moved fast, cuffing Randall while he spat curses drowned by the rain. Ethan was already at the shack door, testing the padlock. It was old but stubborn, the metal swollen from years of weather. He braced his boot against the wall and yanked hard. The lock gave with a screech, the chain falling into the mud. The smell hit him first. Damp, unwashed bodies, mildew, and fear. Inside, the beam of his flashlight found Mia, eyes wide, sitting on the floor near a pair of boys, both around 9, pale and thin, their wrists loosely bound with rope. Mia's voice was a whisper. "You came." Ethan crouched, cutting the ropes with his pocket knife, speaking low to keep them calm. "We're getting you out. Stay close to me and Jake." Outside, Mason's voice cut through the storm. "Water's rising fast. We've got to move now." The drainage channel had already overflowed, and the path they'd taken in was a river of rushing water. Their only way out was the old wooden footbridge spanning the channel, and it was swaying under the force of the flood. Deputy Holt took one boy's hand, Ethan lifted Mia onto his hip, Jake pressed close to his leg, and the second boy clung to Mason's jacket. They made for the bridge as the water surged below, carrying branches, debris, and the occasional flash of white water foam. Mason uncoiled the winch cable from the front of his SUV, anchoring it to the bridge posts. One by one, they clipped on, moving in careful steps over the slick planks. Halfway across, a deep crack echoed through the roar of the flood. One of the supports gave way, and the bridge lurched sideways. "Move!" Mason shouted. They half pulled, half carried the children across, Jake leaping ahead to solid ground. The moment the last of them stepped off, the bridge's far end gave way, snapping into the torrent with a final groan of splintering wood. The children were bundled into the warmth of the SUV, blankets thrown over their shoulders. Mia didn't let go of Jake. Her fingers knotted into his thick fur as if the storm could still take her away. Mason stayed outside with Holt to supervise Randall's transfer into another patrol vehicle. Even in the rain, Ethan could see the relief in Mason's shoulders. Though his eyes were hard, this wasn't over, not with what they'd found. Back inside the shack, Deputy Holt had discovered a battered metal filing cabinet in the corner, half hidden under a tarp. Inside were folders, dozens of them, each marked with names and dates going back 15 years. Missing persons reports, news clippings, Polaroid photos of children and teenagers. Some names Ethan recognized from old posters still taped to gas station windows. It was a chilling archive, the kind of evidence that could tie Randall to disappearances across the region. Mason bagged the files carefully, the storm pounding against the roof like an impatient drum. When they finally drove back to Creeklight House, the rain had eased, though the wind still carried the scent of wet pine and mud. The solar lamps glowed faintly in the mist, a small beacon in the valley. The children were inside within minutes, wrapped in quilts Mrs. Ellery had brought earlier that day. Jake settled at Mia's side, his head resting on her lap, his amber eyes half closed but alert. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, the cool night air on his face, listening to the distant howl of the wolves fade into the mountains. They'd come close to losing more than a bridge tonight, but for now, everyone who mattered was safe. And in the quiet that followed the storm, Creek Lighthouse had never felt more like the refuge Pastor Ruth had envisioned. The storm had finally passed, leaving Bitterroot Valley washed clean under a pale morning sky. The mountains still wore crowns of mist, and the air smelled of wet pine and damp soil. Sunlight streamed over Willow Creek, turning its rippling surface into a path of gold. At Creek Lighthouse, the solar lamps still glowed faintly, though now they were outshone by the day. Inside, the warmth of the small wood stove filled the air with the scent of cedar and coffee. Randall Briggs was in custody. Mason had personally overseen his transfer to the county jail, where he now sat under charges that would keep him behind bars for a very long time. The evidence from the shack, especially the old case files, was already being cross-referenced with cold cases across the state. For the first time in years, the valley's missing children might find their names returned to the light. Mia sat at the low bed frame Ethan had built, her knees drawn up, Jake sprawled at her side. She had clean clothes now, a warm sweater and leggings Mrs. Ellery had found in a donated clothing bin. Her green eyes were still watchful, but there was a softness there that hadn't been before. She reached down and scratched behind Jake's ear, and he leaned into her hand with a sigh, content as if the chaos of the past days had never happened. When her aunt arrived, a woman named Karen Turner, mid-40s, with the same green eyes as Mia, she was trembling as she stepped out of Mason's SUV. Karen was tall but thin, with tired lines on her face that hinted at more sleepless nights than she could count. Life had not been gentle to her. A divorce and the loss of her sister, Mia's mother, had left her navigating the world alone. She dropped to her knees in the gravel, arms open. "Mia!" The girl hesitated only for a second before running into her embrace. Jake followed close behind, sitting beside them like a silent guard. Karen stroked his head. "I think I owe you my whole world," she murmured, her voice breaking. Over the following week, Creek Lighthouse transformed. Pastor Ruth came with clipboards and lists, her auburn hair tied back, glasses slipping down her nose as she paced the clearing. "We'll need bedding here, shelves there, and a lockable cabinet for supplies." Mrs. Ellery brought blankets, jars of canned peaches, and her apple pies, which she guarded from Jake with mock sternness. Ethan found himself building more low beds, crafting tables from reclaimed wood, and even rigging a simple curtain system to make the sleeping spaces more private. It didn't take long for the community to catch on. A local church donated a stack of sleeping bags. The high school woodshop class sent over handmade stools. Mason stopped by between patrol shifts to run safety drills, teaching the older kids how to recognize dangerous situations, how to call for help, and where to go if they ever felt unsafe. He ran the sessions with the calm authority of someone who had seen too much but still believed in preparation over fear. On a Wednesday afternoon, while Ethan was tightening the hinges on the front door, a familiar engine growled in the distance. He looked up to see a dust-streaked Ford F-150 pull into the driveway. Out stepped a man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered with dark hair like Ethan's but cut shorter, the kind that curled just at the nape of the neck. His face was leaner, sharper than Ethan remembered, but the eyes, gray-blue, thoughtful, were the same. Jonah. They hadn't spoken in over 10 years, not since their father's funeral had ended in a shouting match and slammed doors. Jonah stood for a moment, hands in his pockets, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Got your letter," he said. "Took me a while to believe it was from you." Ethan stepped down from the porch, unsure of what to say, and for a moment they just looked at each other, measuring the years. Then Ethan closed the space between them, clapping a hand on Jonah's shoulder. Jonah's arms came up stiffly at first, but then they pulled each other into a hug that was heavier than words. Inside the kitchen container, Jonah sat at the small table, his jacket slung over the back of a chair. Ethan poured coffee, sliding a mug across. The wood stove crackled between them, and Jake lay on the floor with his head resting on his paws, watching as if he knew this was an important moment. "This place," Jonah said, glancing around. "It's not what I pictured when I read your letter. It's better. Feels alive." Ethan told him about the night he'd found the listing for the containers, about Creek Lighthouse becoming a refuge, about Mia. Jonah listened without interrupting, his eyes steady. When Ethan finished, Jonah leaned back. "Sounds like you finally found somewhere worth staying." The conversation shifted then, hesitantly at first, to memories of their childhood nights camping in the Bitterroots with their dad, the year they tried and failed to build a treehouse in the backyard. The laughter came more easily than either expected, and though the years between them were still there, the edges had begun to blur. As evening fell, the lamps outside flickered on, casting warm pools of light across the clearing. Mia and her aunt had already left for home, but Ethan could still hear her laughter from earlier in the day, blending with the murmur of the creek. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. Jonah stood by the door, mug in hand, looking out at the lamps. "House of Light," he said quietly. "It fits." Ethan nodded. "That's the idea." Jake wandered over, nudging Jonah's leg until the man scratched behind his ear. Jonah smiled down at him. "Guess I owe you too, buddy." "Ooh." For a moment, the three of them stood together in the soft glow from the lamps, and it felt like something lost had been found again, not just for the people Creek Lighthouse sheltered, but for the brothers themselves. By mid-October, Bitterroot Valley had turned into a patchwork of gold, rust, and deep green. The air held that crisp edge that promised winter was waiting just beyond the next ridge, and the scent of wood smoke drifted from chimneys along Main Street. Down by the bend in Willow Creek, Creek Lighthouse was at the heart of the preparations for the town's annual Willow Lights Festival, a tradition where the community strung lanterns and strings of bulbs through the willows and along the creek bank to mark the end of harvest season. This year, for the first time, the festival would spill into the clearing around the two containers, their weathered steel sides now painted a warm sage green with fresh trim. Ethan stood in the clearing, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, watching as Pastor Ruth coordinated a group of teenagers threading fairy lights between the porch posts. She was in her element glasses perched on the end of her nose, her auburn hair coming loose from its bun, moving briskly between tasks with a clipboard in hand. Mrs. Ellery sat at a folding table, wrapping paper cones of roasted chestnuts and barking gentle orders at anyone who came too close to Jake's tail as he lay beside her chair. By late afternoon, the festival was in full swing. Strings of warm light crisscrossed overhead, their glow reflected in the dark water of the creek. Families wandered between stalls selling apple cider, carved wooden toys, and jars of local honey. Jonah was near the south edge of the clearing, deep in conversation with a tall, raw-boned man in his 60s who owned the old sawmill. The two of them were sketching on the back of a feed store calendar, Jonah's finger tracing lines as he explained his idea for a small woodworking shop beside the containers. He wanted to teach local teenagers how to build furniture, mend fences, and work with their hand skills that might open doors for kids who didn't have many. "Ethan," Jonah called when he caught his brother watching, "if we put it here, we can use that wall for storage racks, and the kids can work under a covered awning no matter the weather." Ethan just smiled. It was the kind of practical vision their father would have approved of, and the thought made the cold in his chest ease. Near the main table, Mason was setting up for his first survival skills class, a weekend program he'd decided to launch after seeing how quickly the rescued children responded to structure and learning. He wore a flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, talking to a group of kids about knot tying with the easy patience of someone who understood the value of slow, deliberate instruction. A boy no older than 12 was concentrating fiercely on a length of rope, while Mason gently corrected his grip. As the evening deepened, the crowd gathered near the porch for the festival's small ceremony. Pastor Ruth stepped up to the microphone, her voice warm and steady as she thanked the community for coming together, for refusing to look away when help was needed. Then she called Mia forward. The little girl, now healthier and more sure of herself than the day she'd arrived shivering at the door, wore a red sweater and a wide grin. She carried a folded sheet of paper in one hand and glanced at Ethan before stepping up to the mic. "My name is Mia Turner," she began, her voice small but clear in the cool night air. "I want to thank everyone who helped me when I was lost. I found the light because there were people who didn't give up." Her eyes darted to Jake, sitting at Ethan's side, his amber gaze fixed on her. "And because of one dog who stayed with me when I was scared." The crowd murmured, some wiping at their eyes. Mason stepped forward then, holding a small velvet box. "On behalf of Bitterroot County Sheriff's Office," he said, opening it to reveal a bronze medallion on a ribbon, "we present Jake with the title of Honorary Therapy K9 for his courage and his comfort to those in need." He bent to slip the ribbon over Jake's head, and the dog blinked solemnly, then wagged his tail, drawing a ripple of laughter from the crowd. Ethan looked out over the gathering. The soft glow of the lanterns, the sound of the creek whispering through the willows, the faces of neighbors and strangers alike. Just months ago, this clearing had been a forgotten patch of land, the containers rusting in the weeds. Now it was full of life and purpose. His gaze settled on the woodworking sketches in Jonah's hands, on Mason surrounded by eager kids, on Pastor Ruth smiling like she'd known this would happen all along. And for the first time in a long while, the ache that had lived in his chest since Claire's passing was not sharp, but gentle, like the slow closing of a wound. As the crowd dispersed into pockets of conversation and music began to drift from a small band near the creek, Jonah came to stand beside him. "You know," Jonah said, eyes on the lights swaying above, "this place was supposed to be your second chance. Looks like it turned into everyone's." Ethan didn't answer right away. Jake leaned against his leg, warm and steady, and the night air was full of laughter and the smell of cinnamon and pine. Finally, Ethan nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's exactly what it is." In the end, the story of Creek Lighthouse is not just about a place or even the people who found safety there. It is about the way light always pushes back the darkness, how even when hope seems gone, God can place the right people at the right time in the right place to change everything. Jake's loyalty, Ethan's courage, Mason's dedication, Jonah's return, and the open hearts of a small town became a living reminder that miracles are not only in the pages of the Bible, they happen in our streets, our neighborhoods, and in the quiet moments when we choose to act with love. In our daily lives, it is easy to be caught up in routine and overlook the silent struggles of those around us. This story calls us to look closer, to be the hand that lifts, the voice that comforts, and the light that shines for someone lost in the dark. When we make space for kindness, we make space for God to work through us. And sometimes the smallest act can become the answer to someone's prayer. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real. Leave a comment to tell us what it means to you, and if you believe God still works miracles through ordinary people, type Amen in the comments. Subscribe to the channel so these stories of hope can continue to find the ones who need them most. May God bless and protect you and your loved ones today and always.